Why is it that ESL students or EFL or English as an additional language students cannot make practical use of the English language even after years of ESL education? This brief presentation is to respond to this very important question. Now, in order to respond to this question, we will discuss the two approaches to the English as a second language teaching, the subject teaching versus the language teaching approach. First of all, the subject-focused ESL approach is actually an approach where the focus is on the curriculum aims, the development, implementation, teaching, and evaluation of English as a subject. In other words, the curriculum is developed and implemented, and the process of teaching and the process of English language education is evaluated in a way where the focus is on the learning of English as a subject. And in terms of, and this approach actually is something where English is treated like other subjects such as the social studies or history or science, etc. On the other hand, the ESL language focus approach is an approach where the focus is on the structural and functional aspects of the English language. And so that actually means that the focus is on the learners listening, speaking, reading, and writing skills, and also on their knowledge and skills of grammar, structure, and vocabulary. The language focus skill generally has a focus on developing the abilities of the ESL learners in terms of the use of English in practical life. So these are the two main approaches generally. And so in educational context, one or another approach is generally used, or in some cases there is a combination. There might be a combination of these two focuses. Now, a bit of explanation of the subject focus versus the language focus. The subject focus actually is something where the focus is on the subject matter of the ESL contents. So what that actually means is that the knowledge, generally the focus is on giving students knowledge related to the content of the English texts that are included in their courses. And so generally they need to, the students are made to read certain texts, and then there is some level of writing, but actually that writing is a kind of reproduction of the already provided material in textual form. Besides, in this approach, the focus is on the memorizing abilities and the recall abilities of the students. On the other hand, in the language focus, the subject matter generally is language rather than the subject matter or content. And so the four main components of the language, that is listening, speaking, reading, and writing, are emphasized independently of the subject matter. So the subject matter or the content is not the focus. The focus is the four main components of the language, and then creativity. So here, the focus of the students listening, speaking, reading, and writing is basically on developing their creativity in terms of going beyond the subject content of the textbooks. Then when it comes to the implementation, generally in the subject focus approach, there is top-down or teacher-centered implementation. So the teacher leads the process of instruction or the content delivery. On the other hand, in the language focus approach, the implementation is interactive and student centered. So it is generally the student led activities in terms of the classroom teaching or implementation of the curriculum, and the teacher generally serves as is a guide or as someone who assists in the process of the curriculum implementation. When it comes to evaluation, the subject focus approach is based on traditional memory based written exams, and so generally the evaluation is limited to the abilities to evaluating the students' abilities of recall, generally reading and writing in a very limited, with a very limited focus of the content. On the other hand, the evaluation process in the language focus approach is on innovation and practicality, and it is more comprehensive. So the students are evaluated not on some ready-made material, but they generally the focus is on their general critical understanding of the language in a social context rather than a particular subject matter that is already given in textbooks. Or and in terms of the outcomes, generally what happens is that in the subject focus approach there is passive learning on the part of the students, while in the language focus the learning is active, where language is actually used as a tool for learning. And so once the students become expert in the language in terms of the four skills, they have the ability to become more independent and active learners. So these are the two approaches to the ESL language, the language teaching. Now, generally, I personally consider the subject approach less effective in terms of the ESL learning and in terms of making students more efficient in practical understanding and use of language as compared to the language focus. And this is mainly because the main aim of the ESL, EFL or EAL should be to enable learners to use English in its functional sense rather than to have an academic understanding of the language in its social, cultural, or historical contexts. Secondly, the focus of the ESL teaching should be less on teaching English as a subject or as a means for adding to the general or cultural knowledge of learners, and more on teaching English as a tool of effective communication, which is where the English as a second language or as an additional language or as a foreign language is something that is more useful for the learners who understand, basically who need to understand and to have expertise of the English language in a more practical sense, so that this is more useful for them when it comes to communicating beyond their borders, to getting jobs and to get exposure to a wider world of opportunity. So generally, this approach actually means the language focus approach is something that I personally would favor in comparison to the subject focus. And this is mainly because there is likelihood that this will give the ESL learners a better chance to have a more effective command and a more practical command of the language that they can use in an applied, in a functional, and in a more comprehensive way. So Again, we need to the question that I asked in the very beginning. Why is it that after years of school education, college education, and also the university education, the ESL learners are unable to make practical use of the English language? That is both in its written verbal form and in terms of actually listening comprehension, or in terms of proper pronunciation, or in terms of communication. Why is it that students are unable? And so I personally think that the issue is because English is as a second or foreign language is not taught as an active, dynamic, and living language, but as a dead language, as something that is taught as a subject rather than something that they can make use of in a practical sense. And so a better approach would be to make use of the ESL classes, the ESL curriculum, to make students, to enable students to make good practical and functional use of language, so that they can listen with understanding and comprehension, so that they can speak well and coherently and fluently, so that they can read with understanding, and so that they can actually develop good vocabulary structure and grammar, and so that they are able to make to write effectively, and generally to overall make use of the English language for better and useful communication.